Nobody in that kitchen expected the slap to be the second biggest mistake Vivian Cross made that week. The first one was buried in a folder she didn't know the maid had already read. Hey, welcome back. Before tonight's story starts, drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. This one's about pride, about a slap that never should have landed, and about a truth that had been sitting quietly in a drawer for 6 days, just waiting for the right moment to come out. Stay till the end, because what the maid says next changes everything. Her name was Renata Cruz, 33 years old. For the past year and a half, she had worked as a private household maid for the Whitcombe family, one of Denver's most prominent names in commercial real estate. Renata moved through the estate with careful precision, kept her opinions to herself, and had learned a long time ago that the safest way to survive in a house like this was to see everything and say almost nothing. The man of the house was Grant Whitcombe, 36, heir to a real estate empire his grandfather had built from a single downtown property into a portfolio spanning 4 states. Grant was quiet, distracted, usually buried in acquisition paperwork, and treated Renata with the same polite indifference he'd treated most people who weren't directly useful to his next deal. His fiancée, however, was an entirely different presence in the house. Vivian Cross, 30, had grown up the daughter of a mid-level executive who'd spent Vivian's entire childhood chasing the exact kind of wealth she'd finally married into. She wore her engagement to Grant like a promotion, and she treated the household staff the way some people treat furniture they're mildly annoyed by. Present, necessary, but beneath acknowledgement. She'd made it clear from her first week visiting the estate that she considered herself already the lady of the house. Months before any wedding had actually taken place, Renata endured it. Not because she lacked pride, but because she had a younger sister finishing nursing school back in Colorado Springs, tuition that didn't care about Renata's dignity, and a promise she'd made to their mother before she passed that Renata would see that tuition through to the end, whatever it took. What nobody in the Whitcombe household knew, what Renata had never once mentioned in a year and a half of quiet service, was that before she wore a maid's uniform she had spent 9 years working in corporate compliance and internal audit for one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the Mountain West. The very same industry Grant Whitcombe's family had built their empire in. She knew contracts. She knew fraud patterns. She knew, better than almost anyone in that house, exactly what it looked like when numbers didn't add up the way they were supposed to. She'd left that career 4 years ago after her mother's illness required constant care, draining both her savings and her energy until there was nothing left to give a demanding corporate job. Cleaning houses had been meant to be temporary, flexible work to get her through a hard season. The hard season had never fully ended. 6 days before the day everything changed, Renata had been organizing files in Grant's home office at Vivian's request. Vivian wanted certain boxes moved before a contractor came to renovate the space. When she came across an unmarked folder that had clearly been placed somewhere it didn't belong, tucked behind old tax documents in a box meant for storage, Renata wasn't looking for anything. She almost didn't open it at all. But something about the folder's placement, deliberately hidden rather than simply misfiled, made her pause. Inside were bank statements, a series of wire transfers to an account Renata didn't recognize, and correspondence between Vivian and a man named Marcus DeLuca. Correspondence that made clear, within the first 2 pages, that Vivian had been quietly siphoning funds from a joint household account Grant had set up for wedding expenses, funneling nearly $180,000 over 4 months into what appeared to be Marcus's failing restaurant business, along with messages that made the nature of Vivian's relationship with Marcus considerably more complicated than wedding vendor. Renata's compliance training kicked in before her shock fully caught up. She photographed every page carefully, replaced the folder exactly as she'd found it, and said nothing to anyone, not out of cowardice, but out of the hard-earned understanding that accusations without airtight proof, made by household staff against a soon-to-be lady of the house, tended to end in exactly one outcome: the staff member unemployed and discredited within the hour. She decided to wait. To watch. To see if Vivian would show her hand on her own, the way people like Vivian always eventually did. She didn't have to wait long. 6 days later, in the kitchen, over something as small as a wrongly folded napkin, Vivian Cross raised her hand and slapped Renata Cruz across the face in front of 2 other staff members, and Renata finally decided the waiting was over. The slap landed hard enough to leave a faint red mark blooming across Renata's cheek, sharp enough that the 2 other staff members in the kitchen, a young server named Priya and the estate's longtime cook, Marcus Delgado, both froze mid-motion, eyes wide. waiting to see what would happen next. That napkin was supposed to be pressed for the Hendersons' dinner tonight, Vivian snapped, her voice climbing, hands still faintly raised as though she might strike again. Do you understand how important this dinner is? Grant's biggest investors are coming, and I cannot have this house looking like it's run by people who can't even fold linen correctly. Renata didn't move for a moment. She simply stood there, one hand rising slowly to touch her stinging cheek, feeling something inside her shift from the careful, practiced patience she'd maintained for a year and a half into something colder, steadier, and entirely calm. You're going to want to lower your voice, Miss Cross, Renata said quietly. Vivian let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. Excuse me, did you just tell me what to do in my own house? It's not your house yet, Renata said, still calm, still even. And you might want to think carefully about how this conversation continues, because I think you already know what's in the folder you hid behind the tax documents in Grant's office. The kitchen went silent in the particular way rooms do when everyone senses the ground has just shifted beneath them. Priya's eyes darted between the two women, sensing something enormous unfolding that she didn't yet understand. Marcus, the cook, quietly set down the pan he'd been holding. Vivian's face, moments ago, flushed with anger, drained of color entirely. I don't know what you're talking about, 180,000. Renata said simply, wired out of the joint wedding account over the last 4 months, into Marcus DeLuca's restaurant. I have photographs of the statements. I have the correspondence too, if you'd like me to be more specific about what kind of correspondence it was. Vivian's mouth opened, then closed, her earlier fury collapsing into something closer to panic. You went through my private things. I was organizing files at your request, Renata said. The folder wasn't hidden well enough for that not to happen eventually, Miss Cross. I'd suggest, going forward, that you keep in mind exactly how many people move through this house every day who aren't invisible just because you've decided not to look at them. You can't prove any of that means what you think it means, Vivian said, her voice trembling now, torn between denial and dawning panic. I don't have to prove what it means, Renata said. I just have to hand it to Grant and let him ask you himself, though I imagine the messages between you and Marcus will make the meaning fairly clear on their own. The color that had drained from Vivian's face was replaced, slowly, by something closer to desperation. Please, she said, her voice dropping entirely, all pretense of authority gone. Please don't. I can explain. It's not what it looks like. You slapped me across the face 6 seconds ago over a napkin, Renata said, still holding her cheek, still perfectly calm. I don't think you're in a position to ask me for anything right now. It was at that exact moment that Grant Whitcombe walked into the kitchen, drawn by the raised voices, still in his work clothes from an afternoon of site visits, completely unaware of what he was walking into. What's going on in here? He asked, looking between his fiancée's pale, trembling face, Renata's reddened cheek, and the 2 frozen staff members still standing near the counter. Nobody answered immediately. Vivian opened her mouth, some version of an explanation clearly forming. But Renata spoke first, her voice steady and clear. Mr. Whitcombe, I think you should sit down. There's something in your home office you need to see. And something your fiancé and I need to discuss with you together. Grant's expression shifted from confusion to genuine alarm. Renata, what is this about? It's about the wedding account, Renata said simply. And about $180,000 that isn't in it anymore. Vivian's knees seemed to weaken slightly, one hand reaching for the counter to steady herself. Grant, she's lying. She went through my things. She's trying to. I have photographs of the bank statements, Renata said, cutting through Vivian's rising panic with the same even calm she'd carried the entire conversation. Dated, time-stamped, and matched against the wedding account withdrawals your own bank would confirm in about 10 minutes if you called them right now. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, Mr. Whitcombe. I'm asking you to look at the numbers yourself. Grant stood very still in the doorway of his own kitchen, looking between the 2 women, slowly beginning to understand that the next 10 minutes of his life were about to be very different than he'd expected when he walked in asking about raised voices. Show me, he said quietly. Renata retrieved her phone from her apron pocket and pulled up the photographs she'd taken 6 days earlier. The bank statements, the wire transfer confirmations, the correspondence between Vivian and Marcus DeLuca that left very little room for interpretation. She handed the phone to Grant without another word, watching his expression change page by page as the full weight of what he was reading settled over him. Vivian remained frozen by the counter, watching her fiancé's face shift from confusion to disbelief to something far colder, far more final, with each swipe of the screen. This can't be real, Grant said quietly. more to himself than anyone else in the room, staring at a message thread between Vivian and Marcus that made clear their relationship extended well beyond a business arrangement. He looked up at Vivian, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. $180,000. Our wedding account. You've been sending it to him. Grant, I can explain. Vivian started, her voice cracking now, all composure fully abandoned. Explain what exactly? Grant said, his voice rising for the first time. Years of quiet corporate composure finally cracking under the weight of what he was holding in his hand. Explain why you slapped my housekeeper over a napkin while sitting on this. Explain how long this has actually been going on. 8 months, Vivian said, barely audible, tears now streaming freely down her face, though whether from genuine remorse or simple panic at being caught, nobody in that kitchen could say for certain. It started before we were even officially engaged. I was going to end it, I swear. Marcus's restaurant was failing, and I thought if I could just help him get through the opening season. With my money, Grant said flatly. Money meant for our wedding. While you were planning to marry me. Vivian had no answer for that. She simply stood there, mascara streaked, hands trembling. The careful image she'd spent a year and a half constructing collapsing entirely in the middle of a kitchen she'd never once treated with basic respect. Grant turned to Renata, still standing quietly by the counter, the red mark on her cheek now fading but still faintly visible. She hit you, he said, not a question, simply a fact he was only now fully processing, over a napkin. While hiding this, she did, Renata confirmed simply. Why didn't you come to me the moment you found the folder? Grant asked, though there was no accusation in his voice, only genuine confusion. Because I had no proof anyone would believe over your fiancé's word, Renata said honestly. A maid making accusations against the woman about to become lady of this house tends to end one way, Mr. Whitcombe, and it isn't in the maid's favor. I needed to be certain, and I needed a moment where the truth couldn't be quietly buried or explained away before you ever saw it clearly. Grant absorbed that for a long moment, something like genuine shame crossing his features. You shouldn't have had to wait 6 days to feel safe telling me something like this in my own house. No, Renata agreed quietly. I shouldn't have, but here we are. Priya and Marcus the cook, still frozen near the far counter, exchanged a glance loaded with the particular disbelief of witnessing something that would become kitchen legend for years to come. Neither of them said a word, watching the scene unfold with the careful stillness of people who understood they were witnessing something that wasn't theirs to interrupt. Vivian, seeing the last of Grant's composure hardening into something final, made one last desperate attempt. Grant, please? We can figure this out, I love you. What happened with Marcus was a mistake, but the money, I can pay it back, my father can help, please just give me your ring, Grant said quietly. The kitchen went utterly silent. Grant, give me the ring, Vivian. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You slapped a member of my household staff over a folded napkin while stealing from our wedding account to fund your affair. I don't need to figure anything out. I need you to leave. Vivian's hands shook as she slid the ring from her finger, staring at it for a long moment before setting it on the kitchen counter with a small, final click that seemed to echo louder than it should have in the sudden silence of the room. I'll have someone help you gather your things from the guest wing, Grant said, already turning away from her, his attention shifting instead to Renata, still standing quietly by the counter with a fading red mark on her cheek and a phone full of evidence that had just ended an engagement in under 15 minutes. I'm sorry, he said to her, and this time the words carried real weight. For all of it. The slap. The 6 days you spent carrying this alone because you weren't sure I'd believe you. That's on me, not just her. Renata studied him for a long moment before answering, something in her expression finally softening after days of careful, deliberate calm. Apology accepted, Mr. Whitcombe. But maybe start by asking the people in your house a few more questions before you assume you already know everything worth knowing about them. Maybe start by asking the people in your house a few more questions before you assume you already know everything worth knowing about them. Vivian Cross left the Whitcombe estate that same evening, escorted quietly by 2 staff members who packed her belongings while Grant sat alone in his study, staring at bank statements that represented far more than money. 8 months of a relationship that had never been what he believed it was. The engagement was called off within days, announced through a brief, unremarkable statement that gave the press nothing to speculate on beyond irreconcilable differences. Though word of what actually happened in that kitchen eventually made its way through Denver's social circles. Regardless, the way these things always do, Vivian's father, upon learning the details, quietly settled the missing $180,000 with Grant directly, eager to avoid the kind of legal exposure and public embarrassment a fraud claim against his daughter would bring to his own business relationships in the city. Marcus DeLuca's restaurant, ironically, closed permanently 4 months later regardless. The funding hadn't been enough to save something that had likely been failing, for reasons that had nothing to do with money at all. Renata Cruz didn't ask for anything beyond an apology, but Grant insisted on more. A week after the engagement ended, he sat down with her in his study. Not his kitchen, not a hallway conversation, but a proper meeting, the kind he'd never once extended to household staff before. "I want to actually know what you did before this job," he said. "Not because I feel guilty, though I do. Because I should have asked a long time ago, and I'm asking now." Renata told him, 9 years in corporate compliance and audit, the mother whose illness had ended that career, the sister still finishing nursing school, the promise she'd made and kept quietly for 4 years. Without a single person in this house ever thinking to ask what she carried outside of it. Grant listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, he made her an offer that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with genuine recognition. A position overseeing internal compliance and financial oversight for the family's property management division. A role that used exactly the skills that had sat dormant, unacknowledged, in a maid's uniform for a year and a half. "I need someone who actually looks closely at numbers," Grant told her. "You've apparently been doing that in this house the entire time, whether anyone realized it or not." Renata accepted, on the condition that her sister's remaining tuition be handled through a standard employee education benefit, not a favor, not charity, simply the kind of package any qualified compliance officer would reasonably negotiate. Grant agreed without hesitation. A year later, Renata sat in her own office at Whitcombe Properties, reviewing quarterly compliance reports for a company that, ironically, now ran cleaner internal audits than most of its competitors, partly because its lead compliance officer understood, better than most, exactly how easily fraud hides in places people assume are too polished to check. She thought sometimes about that afternoon in the kitchen. The sting of the slap, the 6 days of careful silence before it, the moment she'd finally decided that waiting for permission to matter wasn't the same thing as actually mattering. She didn't regret the wait. She'd needed the proof. But she never forgot how close the truth had come to staying buried, simply because nobody had thought to ask what she knew. Here's the truth this story leaves us with. The people closest to you, the ones who fold your napkins and manage your household and stay quiet through your worst moments, often see far more than you realize. And know far more than you've ever bothered to ask. Cruelty doesn't erase competence. It just makes it easier to underestimate until the moment it matters most. If this story moved you tonight, if it reminded you that dignity and truth outlast humiliation every single time, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that the quiet ones are often watching closer than anyone realizes. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember, the truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be heard.